let's zoom out a minute and see if we can really simplify some of the problems that we have looking at this these set of crustal blocks that we've all been talking about. What I did as a first pass here was I took a very nice diagram from Graham Pearson's lithospheric development model that he has made from looking at diamond inclusions and the rhenium-osmium ages of diamond inclusions worldwide to analyze the lithosphere down into the subcontinental lithospheric mantle. And he generated, I've added quite a bit of detail here, but he generated basically a sort of a crust versus mantle age. And is the crust younger than the mantle? And is the crust younger than crust laterally? And is the what are the main age distributions that we find throughout different portions of the crust? And I think this is extremely relevant to the central Youanmi Terrane, the western Youanmi Terrane, the Naria Terrane, and the boundary with the southwest terrain. So, for example, let's look at a subduction accretion style development of the lithosphere, and you would have these kind of shallow angled trajectories within the crust, but also in the mantle, with these age signatures within them. Whereas something like lateral block accretion, I don't exactly know what that is, but that would contain more vertical distributions of ages. And I can tell you now that these maps, these isotopic maps that we look at, contain information telling us that there is a lot of lateral age variation in the northwest Yulgan. So something like what you see in the top example. And also, I'll show you that there is significant evidence to indicate that we actually go younger in the lithosphere as we go upwards. And you'll notice not a lot of those models are able to explain a younging upward. So maybe let's ask some questions about ways that we can generate crust in the Archean rather than in a modern tectonic scenario whereby we actually might be doing a lot with our greenstones, and we might be doing a lot in terms of vertical tectonic movements, partial convective overturn, things like sagduction, sagcretion, whatever you might want to invoke there. Let's just bear that in mind. So as Raphael has shown you, we have, from around about 2009 to 2018, we did a lot of work in these square map areas up here, and we pushed out in 2019 into some of this very interesting unknown and unmapped area. However, we had COVID, so that didn't quite go to plan, but the gift we give you is the Southwest Yulgan AGP instead. But what I'm going to say is let's go back in there and have a look at what we might be coming into knowing in the next few years. So we are going back in there, and we're looking also at the Naria terrain significantly. And this blue area, so those red arrows in that blue area is kind of what I'm going to be looking at today. And some of the place names that you have in this area, in red there, greenstone belts at Gulliwa, Kulanuka, Tallering, Twin Peaks, Wongan Hills, those are very significant localities that I'll mention a little bit today. And compare Jack Lowry's PhD work on the mafic geochemistry within the Q rift zone, Q isotopic zone. That is from Meekatharra down to Yelgu and kind of up through here. And so, unfortunately, his PhD stopped there with the geochemical barcoding methodology that allowed, you can see this tremendous detail showing these northwest trending geochemical zones, which he has attributed to some form of subduction-like process within that zone. So we don't quite have that in this area yet, but the current drilling and the current exploration through that area is providing some great extra availability of material we can use to do barcoding type work. So that area is really, it's also a lot of wheat belt land, and it's hard to access a lot of good outcrops. So the drilling is really helping there. So here is just an overview of the mineralization in this area. There it is, just straight from GeoView, where you can see a huge number of iron ore deposits all the way through, and a few dots of gold mineralization. And the red triangles, you have the more base metal-like deposits. So those are the main deposits in this area, stretching all the way down to this new magmatic province near Youanmi, where there's several nickel, copper, PGE deposits. And also I'll mention this little greenstone package at Gulliwa, which contains the Budadu igneous complex, which is probably a little larger than we previously thought. And then Tony's already mentioned some of these small nickel deposits up in the Youanmi Terrane. Tallering is a greenstone belt which abuts right onto the Darling Fault. And this is a great example of some drilling in 2023 that didn't fear moving westward. There's nothing wrong with looking at the things close to the Darling Fault. It seems like all this mineralization approaches the Darling Fault, and there's no reason to think of prospectivity declining at this location. So that VMS deposit there is something we would have predicted from looking at the Southern Cross supergroup, which contains Golden Grove. Golden Grove sits just in here. So the Budadu igneous complex has also shown expanded, has been expanded along strike now with new drilling, and there's significant chrome deposits there as well. And people who have been looking north of Youanmi have also found in this location, but also at Latham, which I think is about here, some smaller examples of nickel copper deposits. And there are other examples of mineralization that I think we'll learn a lot more about in the future, where kimberlites, you see these stars here in these three locations, one of which yields diamond facies mantle xenocrysts, and others which yield spinel facies diamond xenocrysts. They may be able to tell us a lot more about the deeper lithosphere in those regions. And of course, other mineralization styles that I won't mention today. So yes, I think we're seeing encouraging signs that the prospectivity in this area, there's nothing declining really in prospectivity as you go west. And this diagram from the paper we've released on the 2.9 to 3.1 GA magmatism in the Youanmi Terrane shows that there are examples that stretch just outside of the Youanmi Terrane of the Southern Cross supergroup and the Thunderlaris supersuite. And going through that in sequence, you find the ages going slightly younger from 3 billion to 2.95. There's no particular arrangement of those into corridors or in terms of the spatial arrangement of that sequence of magmatism. However, I'll show you that one new age can change this story quite significantly. So I think we're still at a point where you get one more data point and you have to revise your story. But what we have found, as Tony suggested as well, is that there's a very significant hiatus at around about 2.9 down to about 2.82. And I've said before that that is perhaps a significant proto-cratonic stage of the Yilgarn, where you had a sort of cratonization, which didn't produce that huge granite bloom of low calcium granites that we see now. So it wasn't completely stable, and it was able to produce a lot more of a geological record after that. And also I'll draw your attention just to this concept that was an early phase of this figure, which tried to differentiate those ages through time, where some, and we're getting more of these ages now, some of these older than 3 billion ages at Wangan Hills are now up through here, and also just stretching into the Narrier terrane, and also if you include a Milga gneiss or two as well, you'll notice that there's this red zone is actually a greater than 3 billion magmatic zone, whereas the yellow stars are between 2.99 and 2.92. So that zonation strongly correlates to these older neodymium model ages that you see on this well-shown map, with the Q isotopic zone diluting that signal by a large amount of input of material at this age here. So the more input of this age material, like at Windamurra, the Budadu igneous complex, the Meekatharra formation, the Palel group, all of those significant mafic events are focused in this area, and they do peter out as you go just outside the Q isotopic zone. So there's a kind of a horseshoe remnant of older ages, and the region we're looking at now is within that cluster of model ages, some of which are over 3.6. I'll draw your attention to that point there. Texturally looks very similar to the Narrier terrane. I'll also just mention the fact that as we go from the central Youanmi to this western part, there are significant crustal scale features that we have to acknowledge, but we also have to sort of try and see past if we possibly can. There may have been a large degree of marginal uplift. You can see that the boundary with the Narrier terrane is actually drawn along a Proterozoic structure. I would question to say whether some of these amazingly old rocks that Tony has described, are they simply pop-up structures from a deeper crustal level along a Proterozoic, kind of like a flower structure, whereas some units may have been dropped down from higher crustal levels, creating what we do see as a very complicated story there. And then you have the Proterozoic dikes, which have clearly mirrored some of these old cratonic margins, or cut across, like the Widgie-Multha dikes, cut across the Yilgarn in a kind of homogeneous fashion. So maybe we're looking at a kind of a horizontal slice through an old ceramic bowl of some kind, where the edges have been slightly up-tilted. And I'll show you an example of where we might be able to see that in the Youanmi 1 line, which comes in from the Narrier terrane down through Q and down to the Windamurra igneous complex there. And you can see this very steeply bounded package drawn in during the initial interpretation, showing the Narrier terrane as a completely different looking block of crust. Well, it kind of depends how you look at it, because when you zoom in and look at some of these reflectors, you see along this YU1 line, here's some Proterozoic sills, but you see this low reflectivity crust, high reflectivity middle to lower crust. But if you notice here, within what has been interpreted as low reflectivity crust, you have reflectors that are very similar to what you see down here. And this MOHO offset there might also be due to, in fact, these steeply dipping Proterozoic structures. There are no very steeply dipping structures that look anything like that within the Youanmi Terrane. So I'll just zoom through a few previous studies that show the Narrier terrane being very exotic to the Youanmi Terrane. This seems to have been a very popular model for this part of the world. And 2750 million years being a very common time frame for this so-called accretion of an exotic Narrier terrane. Whereas more recent work within the central Youanmi Terrane shows that, yes, subduction signatures can be detected, but actually they do not conform very well to a modern-style subduction accretion process. In fact, there's not necessarily a need to mention the Narrier terrane because the subduction may have occurred within the Youanmi Terrane. And it may have all come from original studies by Myers that show, probably from his Greenland experience, that multiple modern-style subductions were possible during the Archean. So these are the kinds of models that we're dealing with. So when I look at the edge of this Q isotopic zone, it really boils down to looking at this Yalgoo to Singleton greenstone belt, where the Q isotopic zone would kind of come through here and go down like that, terminate at these places. So it really is the extent of what we call the Norrie group and the Palel group. That's kind of where this Q isotopic zone ends. And the recent geochronology has shown that you have a lot of these domes here at 2950 or so, some of which have younger dome behaviors at 2750 that incorporate some of these older Thunder Lara supersweet ages and bring them up as kind of giant rafts. So there's multiple ages here that we've got that kind of have built up this picture. There are stratigraphy through here, right on the western edge. And then in the Gulliver Greenstone Belt, there's a lot of different things going on with a younger basin. The Buddadoo Igneous Complex, which is 2800 MA here, and juxtaposed against these older Southern Cross supergroup ages. And Sanukatoids, as Jack has noted, in Gulliver as well, and a correlation with further north in these northwest trending geochemically defined belts. So I've mentioned those and the younger domes, and Ivan has been working a lot on these structures around the Yalgoo Dome, so we understand this area a lot better than we used to, but this one new age I was talking about changes everything to some extent, and the location is just to the north of the Kulanuka Greenstone Belt. And it is in a quarry in the Wheat Belt, just near Morowa. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do a lot of work around that because of access issues, but we will be trying to go back there this year because it's right practically on the Midwest 2 seismic line. It is the oldest magmatic rock within the Youanmi Terrane, with a magmatic zircons that form a 3270 MA group of zircons here, and one older xenochrist at 3500. It is a migmatic gneiss, and it is an overall Monza-granite composition with local granite diorite. So there it is to the northwest of the Kulanuka Greenstone Belt, which also contains some pretty old rhyolites as well. So the actual stratigraphy there is relatively old compared to the rest of the Youanmi Terrane. And looking at the gravity though, even though on the mag it doesn't really stand out as a significant crustal block, on the gravity, it appears contiguous, perhaps, the overall greenstone belt block here, and could be an example of actual basement. We have never found basement, a contact with between greenstones, supercrustal greenstones, and basement in, let's just say, 20 years of kind of looking for that. I'm going to zoom through this because there's a lot of detail here that we can talk about later within these greenstone packages and the individual age constraints on all of those belts. But it is showing a very unified picture. You can find all of this in the 2022 report that Raf has mentioned, and I'll zoom through some of the photographs just to show you the kinds of rocks. Lots of felsic volcanics and biffs in these rocks, and some younger mafic rocks, 2670 there, that cut through the greenstone belts, quite proximal to the Narrier terrane. Tony showed a very similar looking rock, slightly younger. But what I feel is that we perhaps are looking at the lower levels and plumbing systems of some of the supersuites that cross the rest of the Youanmi terrane. As we move into this northwestern area, close to the Narrier terrane, we're actually seeing more intermediate and mafic components of what we have previously thought were mainly felsic suites. For example, here's a diorite dike cutting an older migmatitic rock near Murgu, but this diorite turns out to be pretty young. So those are the belts. This is the stratigraphic column that we've been working with, where we are finding rocks older than this now. We're finding potential basement to the Southern Cross supergroup. Then we have this magmatic hiatus. And as you move out of the Q rift area, the Q isotopic zone, you have an absence of the 2800 magmatism. So that area, I would argue, is that simply to the east of this older or more regular Youanmi terrane unit. And if you plot these three areas as domains, with the Narrier in green here with all these older ages, you can start to see that this far western Yulgan in orange is very much a transitional unit compared to what you find within the central Youanmi terrane, which is a sniff of these older 2.9 GA rocks and a lot of these younger rocks. After 2.85, there is a shared history between all three of these areas. So really the null hypothesis now for me is that there is no terrain boundary. Yes, there is a domain boundary, but how we think about that needs to evolve from here. I'm very, very much open to many hypotheses of what the differences between these terrains are, but we have some very significant commonality across the terrain boundary. For example, these Hadean zircons are not unique to the Jack Hills. You find them within the Youanmi terrane at Mount Alfred, within the Southern Cross supergroup, constrained here at this age. And as Tony showed, there are units in the Jack Hills area that also have maximum or depositional ages constrained to a similar age. And then there's this seismic character of the Narrier at surface being very similar to the Youanmi at depth. And now we've found these older basement ages within the Youanmi terrane. I don't know how much time I have here, but this significant 3GA package, we have got Hafnium data on this now, and you can see most of it projects back to depleted mantle model ages of around about 3.4 or so GA. And I would suggest that we've only looked at a few of these packages so far, and I think a lot more data will really define that in a much more intricate fashion because, for example, we are getting detrital zircons that plot way off that field here that we've found at Golden Grove and at the Weld Range. So the hafnium data itself also adds to that story, whereby we are finding these narrower terrane aged units possibly at depth as a basement source across wide areas of the Youanmi Terrane. The main development of this 2.8 GA Murchison supergroup is absent in the narrower terrane, but simply may lie to the east. It may have been literally just this zone of rifting and minor subduction-related events at around about 2.8 GA. But then you have this very strongly shared history post 2.75. And in this zone, you tend to have greenstones in proximity to old T2G gneisses. Everything, and including the greenstones, are at higher grade, metamorphic grade, and within the Q isotopic zone, you actually have a lot of lower grade greenschist facies greenstones, which are distal to some of these older gneisses. Back to that story, where can we really think about something that is maybe not a model where exotic terranes are accreted, for example, in this situation, I think is relatively unplausible. And is not entirely autochthonous. We know we have some subduction-related processes occurring. So, and in terms of underplating, I think it's the other way around. We're tending to find older rocks in the lower continental crust rather than younger rocks. So really it is a combination of number 1 and 3, but how we do that through time and space is yet to be determined. So thanks very much. I'll let you read through that as our future work. Thank you.